This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. So Chief Warren on the campaign trail pitching her breakup of big tech idea. Here's the, you heard it over the weekend on Face the Nation. We've talked about it a little bit. Here's her continued prosecution of the case against the Facebooks and the Googles and the Amazons of the world.
So another way to explain that, too, is let's take Apple, obviously a very popular company. It has an app store. Do you believe that Apple should be allowed to sell its own apps on its app store?
So it needs to do one or the other. Either it runs that platform, the App Store, or it's selling its own products on the App Store, but it doesn't do both of those simultaneously, because whenever it does, it has this enormous competitive advantage that wipes out all the other little businesses.
For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined again by Mark Perry, who's professor of economics and finance at the University of Michigan, and his indispensable Carpe Diem blog, which I reference often at the American Enterprise Institute website. Mark, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Yeah, Dan, hey, happy to be back.
So is Elizabeth Warren right? Apple has to pick apps or the platform. It can't do both because it's a monopolist and it's inhibiting the plucky entrepreneur from succeeding in America.
Well, I think we have to make a distinction between what economists call a coercive monopoly, where they have some kind of government license or grant that gives them exclusive, properties or exclusive rights, like let's say the United States Post Office, where nobody can compete against them for first-class mail, and that's a coercive monopoly. But when you look at private businesses and look at Apple or its App Store, first of all, there's no barriers to entry. Anybody can enter into the cell phone market or smartphone market. And, Apple has no way to, eliminate or restrict competitors. And so in a private market like that, it's hard to justify that the government would come in and tell them how to run their business, because they are competing against smartphones and Androids, and so there's that competition. Companies like Amazon or Apple and Amazon are also concerned about potential competition, because those are fields where there are no barriers to entry. Other competitors could eventually come in, and so they have to act very competitively. So I say that the best regulation for businesses is intense market competition, not government oversight and regulation. So that's what we need, and the market does a very good job of regulating businesses to act in a way that is pro-consumers.
It's difficult, right, because there's such antipathy from many quarters towards these big tech companies for all kinds of reasons, ideological reasons, privacy or the lack of privacy reasons, the feeling they're expropriating other people's work and so on and so forth. So it's easy to jump on this bandwagon, as some Republicans have, some center-right types have with Elizabeth Warren. But I think what I hear you're saying is it's time to pull the reins a little bit and remember first principles here. And first principles is you don't want government in the business of other people's business. In other words, picking winners and losers and deciding that company A can do this and company B cannot.
Well, sure, you have all these people, as Thomas Sowell said, who have never run one business for one day, all of a sudden being the busybodies or the anointed ones who are going to tell large, successful, profitable companies how they should run their business. And there's this whole history of, prosecution of very large, successful businesses. Jeff Jacoby, the Boston Globe columnist, had something on Twitter, and he said if Senator Warren had run for president in the 70s, her war cry would have been break up IBM, because how else could consumers be protected from so powerful a typewriter monopoly? Because for 2 years, IBM in the 70s was getting investigated for having a monopoly on typewriters. And I think earlier, maybe in the 60s or 70s, they were investigated for having a monopoly on mainframe computers. So Alcoa Aluminum was broken up or investigated for having a monopoly on aluminum. But in almost all those cases, when you think of if there's any damage or harm to the consumers, in most cases there isn't. isn't. And so in the case of aluminum, prices kept getting lower and lower and lower, and Alcoa did have a dominant market share, but they used low prices as a weapon to repel possible competition. And so, again, if you look at today and you look at Amazon or Apple or Facebook, no one is forced to buy their products or join them. And so, again, if you think of, well, what's the damage to consumers, it just doesn't seem like there really is any, but they continually come up with these fantasy stories that there's some kind of bad monopoly who's engaged in suppressing market competition, when in most cases that's not even really true.
Don't you find it also a bit ironic that those that are very concerned about monopolies that occur in the marketplace, according to them — I don't buy that, but according to them, these monopolists like the big tech companies — there's very little concern about government monopolies, say K through 12 education. So on the one hand, they're opposed to what they perceive as monopolies in the private sector and supportive of, because the same attitude of the likes of Elizabeth Warren opposes school choice at the K through 12 level, charter schools, opportunity scholarships. They support
Sure, I think that's a good point.
Support government
people
monopolies.
Are really concerned about big organizations controlling a market. Yeah, they should look at the K through 12 public school monopoly with unionized teachers. They, I think, control 90% of the market, so they repel competition. They hate charter schools. I mean, that's a good example. The Department of Motor Vehicles, the Post Office. You've got a lot of examples of government monopolies, and people know that usually translates into poor customer service. And so, because they repel competition. Whereas you look at, let's say, Amazon or Apple, they have no ability to control competitors, and so we should leave those markets alone. And again, the competition is the best form of regulation, not government bureaucrats who don't know how businesses operate.
In your Carpe Diem blog, you talked about, Energy and Environment Edition. You talked about climate science, and what exactly does that term mean?
Oh, say it again?
Climate science.
Yeah, you know, I've been featuring that a lot lately because there are a number of people who now have this guy Patrick Moore, one of the co-founders of Greenpeace, has been kind of prominent in the news lately because he's taken on the Green New Deal. And so as we get this narrative that there's this total consensus among scientists, I think there are a lot of respected scientists, including Patrick Moore, who is an environmentalist, who are really kind of challenging the narrative that, first of all, that CO2 is not a pollutant. It's necessary for life on the planet. And that also that a slight warming of the planet is actually a good thing for people like I'm in Minnesota right now, you're in Chicago, so people in Russia, people in Canada. A slight warming of the planet is actually has some significant benefits. And so I think we've really gone overboard on this hysteria about climate change. As Patrick Moore points out, the climate has been changing for billions of years. We act like somehow that's a emergency or something when it really isn't.
Well, and part of the conversation in both of these areas is about proportionality, right? Proportional response. And that's what so many actual scientists in the climate space have argued, including Patrick Moore, we've had on this show a number of times. It's like, look, I understand. I mean, I want to be a good steward of Mother Earth and God's creation, just like anybody else, trying to get a handle on what exactly the problem is and its implications, and then craft a proportional response. A proportional response is not banning air travel. That's not proportional. And it's sort of the same thing with Elizabeth Warren and the other meddlesome busybodies that want to oversee all these different sectors of the economy, if not incorporate them into government in total. It's that's not a proportional response to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is not a proportional response to the 2008 bubble bursting. And what the problems with big tech, whether they be of a privacy nature or other natures, the response is not for the government to tell Apple and Facebook and Google the businesses they can and can't be in and come in there and just decide, how the HR department should be organized.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's often the case that the left and the liberals, they don't really care about people. They care about power over people. And so a lot of these, whether it's, trying to break up monopolies or, have some kind of Green New Deal, a lot of it is just a power grab, and it's a kind of a way to give more power to the government And we just know that that has a history of failure, so it's hard to imagine that it would be any different this time. And so that's a lot of what's behind these political movements is just they're trying to grab power and take more power away from the private sector and put it in the hands of government bureaucrats.
Now, some would argue that, and have argued, well, look, Microsoft was the subject of DOJ antitrust prosecution, and Microsoft still survived and thrived. And so, what about a little bit of oversight and a little bit of tweaking and regulating from antitrust attorneys to make the playing field more fair? And Microsoft is a successful case of an antitrust prosecution.
Well, yeah, I mean, you always have to kind of figure out, is there any damage to consumers? And then also you have to also consider, in all of these cases, you look at IBM, let's say, in the 60s or 70s when mainframe computers were really the dominant, part of the computer industry. And then eventually you, through innovation and technology and entrepreneurship, you come up with all of these new products, and often it's hard to even figure out what's going to come in the future. But I think that's, again, where innovation and entrepreneurship and advances in technology always change the market in ways that are going to challenge the dominant player or the dominant firm in a given period. And I just think that that's making sure that the market is open to innovation and competition is a better way to protect consumers than to have government bureaucrats deciding, whether Microsoft should be broken up and things like that.
He is Mark Perry. He's professor of economics and finance at the University of Michigan, and also, again, must read his Carpe Diem blog each day at the American Enterprise Institute's website. Mark, thanks so much for joining us as always. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Dan and Amy.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
It's what Chicago is talking about. It's Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy on